Josh here today, and we're going to discuss the Rotary Miata swap guide walkthrough that I have kind of worked up to give people something to look at, since there's not really a good centralized source for data for all this on the internet. Um, Everything that I talk about today, links, and everything will be down in the description below. And I will also provide timestamps down below so that you can skip forward and go to whatever little bit of information that you're looking for, so that you don't have to listen to me ramble for 20 minutes about nothing, which I'm really good at doing. So I'll be sure to put all that information down below for you. And let's go ahead and jump into my first talking point, which most people that have probably made it to this point or have found this video are going to want to jump ahead, which is just basic rotary knowledge of the engines that exist and what they come in. So the rotary engine can be broke down into 6 basic engines that everybody recognizes, from the first generation RX-7 all the way up to the RX-8. So you have a 12A and a 13B that both came optioned in the first gen RX-7s. These are different than everything else. Obviously, generation to generation, they had changes. Then you have a 13B, a FC rotary engine, and then you have the 13B FC Turbo, or the Turbo 2 engine. The NA went through several different iterations and changes over the whole model range. The Turbo 2 didn't really change all that much. I think they had a bump in compression later on, much like the NA version. And then you have the twin turbo 13B that came in, the FD RX-7, and then obviously everybody's favorite, the Renesis that came in RX-8, that just, eats apex hills and is always low on compression, and it just needs a starter, bro. No, it doesn't. So, with that basic little tidbit of information covered on the different rotary engines that you could possibly find yourself looking at, depending on what is in your budget and everything else, let's go over to what to look for when you're buying a rotary engine. So, basic things that you should be watching out for, and things that you should do when you go to buy a rotary engine, per se. So, first things first, you're going to want to start with a compression test. If the person is unwilling to provide compression numbers, or is unwilling to allow you to do a compression test yourself, whether you borrow a compression tester from a buddy, or you have somebody local that you reach out to that has one that can let you borrow it, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. It's a big no-no, big red flag. If you're willing to bite the bullet and not do a compression test on it, as long as the motor has 3 solid pulses on each rotor with the spark plugs out, then it's a pretty good indication that the motor will at least be in decent health. Typically, another easy way to tell is if the motor is still in the car and you're going to purchase a whole car that's cheap, which is not really a thing anymore, but that still is possibly an option depending on where you live. If you drive the car around and get it nice and warm, and then turn it off and let it sit there for like 5 minutes and turn it back on, if it's easy to start, typically it's the engine is in pretty good shape. So back on the rotary compression test. So this, what I'm showing you, is the option, pretty much the only option for a rotary compression tester. Mazda sells one, or sold one at one point, and they were thousands of dollars to buy, and I think pretty much only the dealerships had the option to get to them. But this is your best bet for it. It's got some extra functions that the Mazda one didn't even come with, and it gives you a cold rating and an adjusted hot rating if the motor is not warm. And then the last thing that you're going to want to know is the mileage on the motor. So if you have that option, I didn't with mine. I bought a junkyard motor, but if you have that option, you want to take that in consideration on the motor. Something that has good compression but is a high mileage, it may need oil control rings, or the side seals may be dying or something like that. Just because it has good pulses doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have great compression and run great. So next is what Miata are you going to use? So the NA and the NB Miata, pretty much everything that I will cover tonight when I reference a Miata, I'm going to be referencing NA and NB Miatas, because I do not have an NC and I have very limited experience with NC rotary swap. There is a very, very comprehensive NC RX-8 rotary swap in a forum post that I will link below. The guy went through and bought two NC Miatas and put them together because they were both wrecked. And just a heads up with the NC, if you really want to go easy mode with the swap, the only thing that will really catch you or call you out on it and have issues is the wiring in them. But per this forum, the subframes bolt in. RX-8 subframes bolt into NC Miatas. Mazda must have taken after the whole Ford modular aspect of it finally, instead of making everything different in the 90s with the RX-7 and the Miata. But the RX-8 and the NC Miata, as you can see right here in this photo, that is a RX-8 subframe being lifted into the NC Miata, and then it is bolted in. So, same thing with the rear. You can pretty much bolt the rears in, and then you have RX-8 running gear underneath an NC Miata. With that out of the way, the NA and the NB Miata is a little bit more involved than the NC, but that's the one that everybody wants, especially the NA with the pop-ups. Before I go any further, I'm going to talk about options for information that you have available to you. There's the Rotary Miata Club on Facebook. If you have a Facebook, I know a lot of people have kind of shied away from Facebook with dealings with them and security and so on and so forth and privacy. But if you are on Facebook, I suggest joining the Rotary Miata Club. Bunch of really knowledgeable guys in there, including myself, and it's pretty much treated like it is as an old school forum. It's not as much dumb questions. I will still troll people when they ask dumb questions that Google will answer immediately from time to time. But other than that, good group of guys. Best place to start, along with one of the guys that's in the group. His name is Hayden. He's developing a website. He's contacted me and helping him write some of the stuff on the website. It's not complete by any means. There's a lot of information that still needs to be filled in and fleshed out and completed on the website. But there is some articles in here that have been started, and you can click through and find the stuff, and this will be slowly added to. So if you're watching this in 2 to 3 years, hopefully the website is pretty much full, and this video will be almost useless for you. All right, with that little tidbit out of the way, I'm going to start with going through everything on a part-by-part basis, and then at the end, I will kind of discuss what stuff works together and what you have to do with certain things in order for you to be able to take this part, and this part, and go together. Because there's some mods that are required with certain parts that aren't required with other parts. So, first things first, we're going to talk about the subframe. So you can get away with modifying the NA subframe to fit a first or second gen RX-7 engine in there. It is easiest with the first gen. And we'll get to that, why that is later. But it is doable if you're balling on a budget. The subframe can be modified, but it has to be extensively modified. And for a street car, you can probably get away with it. With what I did as a track car, I didn't feel comfortable with the amount of support that I was going to have to cut out of it to get it to work for me. So I went with the next option, which is the V8 Roadster mountless subframe. So this subframe is exactly what it sounds like. It's the mountless subframe. It's the same subframe that you would get if you were to buy a V8 swap kit from them. It just doesn't have the LS mounts or whatever you're going to mount in the car with it. So this is the one that I recommend to everybody. You save 10 pounds over the factory subframe, and it's tubular, so it's stronger, and it stiffens the front end up, and you don't have to run a strut tower brace, which is nice. So this, and even mentions they've actually updated the description. Rotary did not used to be in there, but they've added that to it. And then thirdly, if you know budget is no object, you can do the Lucky Racing Rotary kit. But I must preface this, it has to be an FC engine per the mount description. And then there has not been good reviews of the subframe. Supposedly it's some of the mounting holes and stuff don't exactly line up correctly, and you can have fitment issues and everything else. That's all hearsay. It's just things that people have said in the club and online about the kit. The price has actually come down. It's cheap right now, but I'm sure it's going to go back up. 3 style of engines that you have. Typically, the first gen mounts, you can mount it to any of these. Or the first gen you can mount to the mountless and a modded Miata subframe pretty easily because of the front plate with how it mounts on those engines. The FC, FD, and RX-8 mounts easier on the V8 Roadsters subframe because of how the mounts work on those engines. You can make it work on the factory Miata subframe. This is actually set up in the photo for an FC turbo engine, which we will talk about later. But you can do it. You can see the extensive cutouts there. And then, obviously, as I said before, the first gen engines out of the RX-7 FB work best with a modded factory subframe or the V8 Roadster. Next is the transmissions. So if you go to here, and go over here to the transmission, boom. So there's 2 main options that are really the go-to options for the Miatas when it comes to the transmission with the rotary. You can do the Miata transmission and modify the input shaft and swap the bell housing, or you can do an RX-7 FB FC transmission and swap. I have to preface that it has to be an NAFC transmission. It can't be the turbo. NAFC transmission, and swap the tail section to a Miata tail section so that you can keep the PPF. So what is involved with the first option the bell housing and the input shaft. Mazda Tricks did a write-up years ago and has now converted it over to their new website that you have to physically turn down the input shaft so many millimeters so that when you insert the input shaft into the eccentric shaft, it doesn't bottom out and push the eccentric shaft forward into the thrust bearings, and also it's pretty much so you don't lose your thrust clearance. So the motor has to be able to float. If you just stick that in there, it doesn't have the ability to float around. You can cut more off than you need to on this, but you can't cut less off. If you cut less off, then you run into your thrust issue. The other option, which is the option that I recommend, is the tail housing swap. You literally just keep an RX-7 transmission. You buy a blown up, broke Miata transmission, and you take the tail section off of it and you stick it on the RX-7 trans. They're exactly the same, bolt for bolt, everything. Excuse me. This allows you to keep the PPF and makes it very easy to get your driveline angle worked out and where the engine needs to be placed in the engine bay. Now, with those two options done, there is a third and fourth option. Third option is obviously the Turbo 2 transmission out of an FC, but you have to build a cross member, and that also requires you to possibly have a custom drive shaft made, or cut the one that you have and shorten it, so on and so forth. Same thing with the RX-8 trans. It's pretty close to the same thing as the Turbo 2 transmission, which is also similar to the 6-speed Miata transmission, which is similar to the RX-8 transmission. Remember, Mazda, Ford, modular. It was a thing. Ford did do good things for Mazda. That's the main options for the transmissions. Now, I mean, you can do custom CNC bell housing adapter plates and so on and so forth, and stick whatever transmission you want in there. But we're getting real deep into, okay, you're now multiple thousands of dollars into fitting a transmission into what could be a sub $2,000 or $3,000 car. Next is the subframes, and this is all dependent on whether or not you're going to keep the PPF or not. Let's see here. I have photos of this somewhere. Here it is. So, the subframe mods that you have to do if you don't want to keep the PPF, you have to box the subframe in to square it so that it doesn't, same old, and come off of the boxing, as you can see here, and weld a plate that holds the rear end up so that the rear end is supported, because without the PPF, the rear end isn't supported. Obviously, keeping the PPF is the easy option, but this is very much an option. Next is the one part that nobody likes to talk about, and that's fabrication mods that you have to do. There's really two big things that you have to do. One is modify the firewall. The other is modify the oil pan. And depending on if you're turbo or NA or stuff like that, you might have to do one or both or neither, depending on your setup. So you can go with the first gen RX-7 engine and the front mount plate. You can get away with not modifying the firewall, but you have to trim the oil pan if you mount it low enough on the subframe. That's the big kicker, is if you keep the PPF, then it's usually kicked far enough forward to where you have to modify either the firewall or you have to trim the oil pan to clear the steering rack. And if it's not that, then it's raised too high and it interferes with the firewall. So I wanted to keep the PPF, so I trimmed the firewall to suit and made it so that my steering rack doesn't interfere with the oil pan. I cut this bracket off and welded it up, cut that one off and TIG welded it up. Obviously, with keeping the PPF, you don't have a driveline issue. If you don't, then you have to sit down and you have to do some math and measuring and make sure that your driveline angles for the output of your transmission to the input of the rear end are within so many degrees of each other, and there's not a big angle there to cause issues. I believe I've said this, but a turbo car will require more firewall trimming than a non-turbo car, as you can see here. So this is what Grassroots had to do to clearance the turbo to fit the exhaust and turbo from a Turbo 2 into an NA. I did not have to trim anything on that side of the car. As you can see in my photo, it's all fine. Actually, I think I got a finished photo in here. A little bit further down. Boom. There's a finished tack weld. I just hadn't covered this yet. With that, I mean, the next big thing is radiator options. You have your standard. People have been really successful keeping the factory Miata radiator and fans in the car. You do have to run some custom coolant lines, but you can go to just take you some wire or something and bend it out with the length that you need and everything else, and you take it to AutoZone and get them to find one that's close to it and buy that. The Koyo rad that goes in Miatas works just as good as well, or you can do what I did and go, full baller and build in a custom radiator and oil cooler mount for racing. So mine's all slanted back so that I have more ground clearance and everything else. You can get away with it's if you have a first gen engine, you can run the Beehive if it's a 12A. If it's a 13B, it's gonna require an oil cooler. The factory oil coolers are fine. Just mount them wherever you can. There's great little kits where you can mount it to the radiator just in front of it, and that'll work out great. If you want to do a full-on custom one, I recommend the Improved Racing oil thermostat, and it opens up at 165, which is what the factory oil cooler thermostat opens up at on Rotaries, so that works out great. Now, how do all these parts correlate together? Well, if you do a first gen, you end up with one of these, which is what most people, it's the best budget option, is to have the front cover with the bolt-on, where did that engine go that I was just looking at? With the bolts on the front so that you can, this one. So that you can just cut up the factory Miata subframe and stab it in there. This, like I said previously, this will require typically oil pan modifications unless you severely cut the subframe out and get it nice and low. Then you won't have to do oil pan mods or firewall mods. But rule of thumb, it's typically one or the other, unless you have a crazy driveline angle. The V8 Roadster subframe, like what I've got, pretty much guaranteed you're going to have to do firewall trimming with it if you keep the PPF. If you don't keep the PPF, you can once again get away with, shoving it in certain ways so that it fits just fine. What mod needs to be done on the firewall or the oil pan or on the subframe all determines on whether or not you keep the PPF more than anything. If you don't keep the PPF, it's pretty much you can stab it in there wherever you want to, as long as you can get it to fit. But from my experience, you have to do one or the other. So with all the mods taken care of and what really correlates for what fits and what doesn't, your best budget option that I have here is if you buy a first gen 12A 13B, if you can find one, engine transmission together, with preferably the 12A with the carb, because then you get the carb and the distributor and everything else, and you don't have to worry about crazy wiring or anything like that. You get you mod the subframe, and I believe the Racing Beat header fits with a few mods to it, whether that's like beat on it with a hammer a little bit, or maybe I think you have to cut where the headers come together. You have to cut that and shorten it to clear the transmission tunnel. And then just buy a broke NA MB Miata transmission and take the tail section off of it, and there you go. You've got a rotary swap ready to go right there, if you can fabricate and know that you can do that kind of stuff on a budget. If not, then you have my option, which is go really, really big, and I'll post my spreadsheet here to the go big option. You can see what my planned spend is, what my actual spent was, and then if you subtract the race car parts out of it, that's about how much I'm involved, how deep I am into the Miata. So, even though people say, oh yeah, LS swaps are cheap, Rotaries swaps are relatively cheap, it's not. The problem is never the swap itself, it's everything else that has to go with it. It's your man hours, or if you have to pay somebody to do stuff, it's the custom little bits and bobs. It's the 15 to 20 times that you have to go to Tractor Supply or Home Depot or Lowe's or Metal Depot or whatever. You get your little random nuts and bolts and hardware for simple things. That's the stuff that kills you and makes the price exorbitant. But yeah, so like I said before, I will leave links and timestamps down below. Put questions, comments, anything that you have down below, anything that I might have missed. This is mainly just to kind of get the ball rolling for you. There's still, hundreds of little teeny tiny things that you really need to work out and figure out on your own. But this is a very good jump start, and there's not really a good database or form that's got all this information in a centralized spot. So this should help get the ball rolling for most people. But be sure to subscribe, comment, do all the YouTube bull crap. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out in the Rotary group or down below, like I said. And I will see you next time, guys. Deuces and happy brapping.